first of an 8-part series on the biblical roots of American civilization. Now, the series is based upon 2 premises. First premise is that there is a historically defined American civilization. We are the heirs to Western civilization, but we have our own unique civilization. Second premise is that the principal foundation of this civilization, the American civilization, is the issue of freedom. Now, the defense and implementation of this ideal has set the stage for both conflict with our enemies and for discussion, debate, and conflict in our domestic policies as we try to debate what our ideas of freedom mean. In terms of the first sense conflict, you know, a lot of our conflict overseas and wars that we've been into have been wars that have centered around this theme. And to bring this out, I want to acknowledge a September 28, 2001 article by Brink Lindsay from the Cato Institute. And he wrote this article, it's called The Last Totalitarians. His theme is that the totalitarian movements that rose up in the 20th century rose up as a reaction to the 19th century success of the spread of the individual liberty principles that came out of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. And this is, we'll go into this in a future presentation a little bit later about how these ideas were spread from America, you know, across overseas. And the ideas were gaining currency and actually gaining a certain amount of adherence, you know, globally. The abolitionist movement was partially a response of that. And eventually there was a reaction to that. And the totalitarian ideologues see the concept of individual liberty as an existential threat to their utopian ideas. And so this set the stage for conflict, which sometimes was conflict of ideas, but eventually ended up the conflict, you know, physical conflicts of wars. It also sets the stage for interesting debates domestically, because a lot of our discussions domestically is over the meaning of our notion of freedom and how to implement that notion. Case in point, the healthcare debate that recently we were also passionately involved with. On one hand, you had one side that sees the expansion of government into the private sector realm of healthcare as a dangerous expansion of the role of government beyond what it was constitutionally mandated to do, so therefore it is a threat to our freedom. On the other hand, you have a group that says, well, healthcare is a constitutional right, so therefore it should be guaranteed by government. So you have these two different views of rights and freedom, and they're at loggerheads, and that essentially, that's what this debate is really about. I mean, there's arguments on the side, you know, we have these arguments on the side about whether or not it was enacted properly, you know, whether or not the procedures when it went through, you know, you have the consultation and all, you know, whether or not the Senate and the Congress did this. These are issues too, but in its essence, it was a debate over how our liberties are to be understood and how the liberties are to be implemented. Now, that's one example. There are many, many examples, and I would say that a lot of our domestic political debate is tied to this issue in one form or another. So this is a very important issue, and it is at issue here is how do we understand and how do we implement our idea of human rights. And this is one of the most prominent themes that is a thread through American history. And of course, those, obviously, we all know those rights are enshrined in our Constitution. And we're always talking about, you know, we have a constitutional right to this, we have a constitutional right to that, and we hold the Constitution as the authority in defining those rights. But the Constitution itself and the Declaration of Independence is actually, well, the Declaration of Independence is a summary of certain principles. The Constitution is a legal codification of these principles into legal rights. So if we're going to understand the Constitution, we need to understand the principles that the Constitution is encoding into a legal document. And those principles were developed and enculturated in our society through a period of 180 years. So, you know, there was a period of 180 years leading up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence, leading up to the writing of the Constitution. And I would like to suggest that there is no way that we can understand either one of those documents fully and completely and clearly without understanding the history of ideas and the spreading of ideas and the debating of ideas and the experimentation with different ideas, what works, what doesn't work, that led up to that point. You know, it was, like I said, there's 180 years, and this 180 years I'm referring to, it's at the point in time when the first settlers came to America, the very first pilgrims landed on this shore, up to the time where the Constitution was adopted. That's roughly a 180-year time period. And so during this time period, you had, now I'm using the term Puritans. The Puritans established churches, they established university system, they established schools, they established hospitals, they established charities, they established newspapers. Every institution that you associate with civilization was established by members, by the Puritans, and they didn't control it forever. Eventually these institutions were taken over, but initially they were established by the Puritans. Now I use the term Puritan in a broad sense. You have Presbyterian and Congregational Calvinists, which is the general sense of the term. But in the broader sense of the term, you can include Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, and so I'm using this in the broader sense of the term, because there's the term Puritan came from what came to denote a movement that wanted to purify the Church of England. That's where the term Puritan came from. So some of them were separatists, some of them were non-separatists, some of them are going to purify it from within, some of them are going to separate and create their own, some of them, they had different degrees of radical ideology, and they obviously had they had differences of emphasis in their theology. Now, for all the differences in their theology, their basic worldview concerning human nature and a relationship between the individual and society and how to realize human striving and how to realize the public good was remarkably uniform. So there was a coherent worldview in the midst, for all this diversity in some theological issues, the underlying philosophical worldview was remarkably coherent and consistent. So if you look beyond some of these, you have predestination, you have free will, you have, separation or non-separation, you have a hierarchical church authority, or you have a congregational polity. These were all distinctions and differences, but for all these differences, you had a unanimity of worldview about human nature. So that's what I want to go into. I want to go into this worldview, and this is what we're going to focus on: how they understood this, and how this worldview impacted our understanding of rights and the Constitution. And we're going to go into that. This first lesson is an overview, so we're going to touch on things that are going to be more deeply developed in later. So we're going to touch on a broad number of areas. Now, the early Puritans saw themselves as called by God to undertake what they referred to as an errand in the wilderness. They saw themselves as called by God to set up an experiment in liberty. It would be an inspiration for the rest of the world. So they were interested in their own liberty, but their vision went well beyond that. They considered themselves called by God to engage in experiment in liberty that would be an inspiration, a source of inspiration for the world at large. So they had this very small beginning, very huge vision. Now,